Dr. George King, the director of the Afro-American Studies at the university, and he'll be talking about the African background of the Afro-American myth and reality. Dr. King?
Just finishing up with a bout of the flu, so I may have to have one of these so my voice won't leave me. I certainly would like to take this opportunity, first of all, to congratulate you for this program. I think that looking at the program, it is certainly an interesting one, and I think that as perceptive, aware students, that that you are due congratulations for putting on a program of this quality, of this nature, during Afro-American History Week. This has not, as you know, been a common practice throughout the throughout the major universities within this country. And it is certainly refreshing to see these kinds of programs now as a part of the regular college activities. Once again, you are to be congratulated for that. The African background of the Afro-American myth and reality. In my statement, I will attempt to do three things. One, to show how the negative image of Africa and Africans was developed and transmitted to Afro-Americans. Two, briefly survey the Africa from which Afro-Americans were brought during the slave trade. And three, say something about the Afro-American changed image of Africa based on the assumption that what happens in Africa still conditions the self-concept of the Afro-American and his world view. When a Dutch ship deposited 20 Africans at Jamestown in 1619, this event brought together two races of people whose interrelationships were destined to be the central focus of concern in this budding nation for over 300 years. To be sure, this problem was at times overshadowed by other interests that seemed momentarily more imminent. Issues like independence, civil war, people in the West, industrialization, world entanglements, and the dream of landing on the moon. All of these played their roles in the drama of American history. Yet, at every stage of this process, there was the chronic and persistent problem of race which continued to gnaw at the vitals of American society. Although in the 350 years between 1619 and about 1969, the status of the black man in America has changed. Many of the concepts which undergirded the status of the black man have remained relatively the same over these 3.5 centuries. Even more relevant to our concern here today is the fact that too often these concepts are rooted in myths. Myths which fashion an image of the black man that prismatically reflect his status. Thus, the image becomes the reality, and this spurious reality becomes a seedbed for a new myth. The essential fact is, then, that racial difficulties in this country between blacks and whites have an historical basis, that they are traceable in large part to the manner in which the races have viewed each other, and that the whites' view of the blacks evolved from a negative image of Africans into the full-blown American stereotype. And finally, that all this was crusted over by an elaborate myth designed to explain and justify a course of action which was at its best anti-humanistic. Perhaps nowhere in the Afro-American past is myth so potent as an image maker as in discussions of his African background. These myths, as though regulated by some unseen, unknown, but all-powerful rule of grammar, decline according to both place and person. Paul Bohannon in Africa and the Africans lists a number of myths so pervasive and so glib that an understanding of the reality of Africa has to await the clarification of these myths. For example, the myth that Africa is a series of jungles filled with lions. Lions do not live in jungles, and only 5% of the African continent can be called jungle. This is a symbol of fear or even perhaps of apprehension. The myth that Africa is the dark continent. Now this is a case of a subject-object confusion. Since Europe did not know about Africa, the assumption was that Africa was not known or Africa did not exist. In fact, during the Middle Ages, Africans, Arabs, and Indians had been trading with each other across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean for years. There is something a bit comical about Europeans discovering mountains and rivers and lakes that had been known to the East for centuries. Then the myth that Africa was savage. Here again, this is another myth that is a product of 17th and 18th century European expansion, when the noble savage was needed to justify certain commercial, religious, and romantic movements that were afoot. Perceptively, Bohannon notes that the fact that Afro-Americans came from Africa as slaves, and because they have absorbed these myths, their reaction to Africa have been ambivalent. The myth that the new African nations must either be for or against the U.S. in world affairs, and finally the myth that the West has an African problem can be reversed to read that Africa has a Western problem. It seems to me that indicating these myths at this point might underscore the difficulty of understanding and placing in proper perspective any historical antecedents to contemporary problems. Certainly, I think that we can conclude that the general problem has been the working misunderstanding that has characterized much of the relationships between Africa and the West. Since the opening of the modern period, contacts between the West and Africa have assumed a variety of forms and have stemmed from a congruity of motives. The first significant contact was, of course, the slave trade of Europe and Africa. Not only did this intercourse take from Africa a large percentage of its efficient population, the flower of its youth, but it brought into contact questionable representatives of each culture. Avaricious and callous sea captains and power-hungry and debauched chiefs were hardly the pillars on which to build mutually respectful relations. Yet, for several centuries, these were the essential agents through which Africa and the West had come to know each other. And once again, this would certainly not be the desirable kind of relationship for the gaining of mutual respect. The quality of cultural contacts, I think, are determined to some extent by the type of individual involved. Not only had our view of Africa been obscured by the generalized fiction about Africa as a place, but emerging also from the myth-making process has been a common stereotype of what Africans are like. Africans have been variously pictured as a childlike race, improvident, savage, lazy, and addicted to stealing and lying. This stereotype was bequeathed to the masses of Europe and America, whose image of Africa and Africans was largely built on the implied assumptions of innate inferiority found in the stereotype. The African stereotype, like its counterpart, the stereotype of the Afro-American, is the product of centuries of evolution and was generously supported, if not originated, by a large body of 18th century pseudoscientific European thought. The central focus of this thought was placing the black race in its proper slot in nature. And out of the body of literature thus developed came some rather elaborate myths, some rather elaborate theories of the origins and classification of races. The general import of these theories was that the African should be placed on the lowest rung of the human ladder. Biological arguments, whether based on monogenesis or paleogenesis or simple myth, generally reach the same conclusions. The problem, as Philip D. Curtin notes in The Image of Africa, was the development of a system of classification of races in which the races could be arranged in order of quality. Curtin continues, since there is no strictly scientific or biological justification for stating that one race is, quote, higher, unquote, than the other, the criteria of ranking had to come from non-scientific assumptions. All of the biologists, that is your 18th century biologists, gave some order of classification, but few of them stated the basis for doing so. Their unstated assumptions, however, were clear enough. All of them began by putting the European variety at the top of the scale. Of interest also was the preoccupations of 18th century students of race with physical characteristics, especially facial features. While measurements of prognathism and other features represented attempts to quantify racial differences, the conclusion drawn eventually led to the establishment of aesthetic standards which held that physically the Caucasian type were the most handsome and the most becoming. The significance of these views lies in the fact that they form the basis for a kind of scientific racism, and that they sometimes subtly and at other times blatantly intrude themselves into contemporary political and social action. Once racial differences of Africans were equated with racial inferiority, it was but half a step to render similar judgments about African societies. The evolution of the derogatory stereotypes in regards to African peoples and cultures were not always simple manifestations of racism. In many instances, these stereotypes were called into service to meet a particular need. Much of 18th century political racist literature, especially in Britain, was a justification of the slave trade and a basis for imperial policy. Similarly, some of these 18th century writers, like Rousseau and Hume, at odds with what they considered to be a decadent European society, called into being the noble savages, of which the African was one of the leading prototypes. Even the humanitarian reformers and missionaries used the portrait of the African as a benighted and fallen people to gain what? To gain support for their cause. In much the same way, the late 19th century European expansionists touched up this derogatory stereotype and used it as a key part of an elaborate system of rationalization for imperialistic acquisitions and colonial policy. Although perhaps not in the Mayflower, the negative image of Africa and Africans crossed the Atlantic to America and is easily recognizable in pro-slavery arguments and other racist literature. Indeed, Kenneth Stamp's description of what the antebellum masters considered a model slave is but a practical expression of the same assumptions. Nor did the matter die with the freeing of the slaves. As late as 1910, a highly, quote, respected, unquote, American social scientist, Howard Odum, could still write, and I quote, "Back of the child, and affecting him both directly and indirectly, are the characteristics of the race. The Negro has little home conscience or love of home. He has no pride of ancestry, has few ideals, little conception of the meaning of virtue, truth, honor, manhood, integrity. He is shiftless, untidy, and indolent. The migratory or roving tendency seems to be a natural one to him, and that the Negro shirks details and difficult tasks. He does not know the value of his word or the meaning of words in general. The Negro is improvident and extravagant. He lacks initiative. He is often dishonest and untruthful. He is over-religious and superstitious. His mind does not conceive of faith in humanity. He does not comprehend it. Unquote. That is the statement, as I said, of a 20th century eminent, in quotation mark, social scientist. Concerning the education of Afro-Americans, the same man advises, quote, let the influences upon the Negro child, at least as far as the school is able to effect this end, lead him toward the unquestioning acceptance of the fact that he is a different race from the white, and probably so, that it is always and has been and always will be, that it is not a discredit not to be able to do as the whites, and that it is not necessarily a critic to imitate the life of the white man. That's about the only thing that he said that made any sense. Odom finished with this admonition for the black child, and this was it. He may, quote, he may learn from reading stories of Africa how much better off he is than his cousins, unquote. Another regrettable indication that the myths have not lost all of their potency was the publication and circulation a few years ago of a nasty little old book called Race and Reason by Mr. Putnam. Signs also may be seen in the white backlash and the willingness of politicians to still risk their political fortunes in the waging of racist campaigns. There is some reason to suspect that the endless pratings about law and order by politicians may reflect a search for a new set of rationalizations regarding the status of the black man. 20th century scholarship has done much to explode the misapprehensions connected with the history and culture of the black peoples of Africa. As far as the background of the Afro-American is concerned, the focus is on West Africa. What in fact was the heritage of people brought from Africa to America and enslaved? The safest answer would probably be it was varied like the backgrounds of the peoples of Asia and other continents. But we can do more than that. It is now possible to reconstruct pertinent phases of the history of West Africa with reasonable accuracy. This reconstruction is, however, episodic, though based largely upon first-hand accounts left by Arab travelers and scholars. When one takes even a cursory glance at the history of West Africa, two important facts immediately become apparent. First, between 800 and 1500 AD, there were three significant kingdoms that rose, flourished, and declined in the Western Sudan. Second, after the 9th century, these kingdoms were seriously affected by the spread of Islam, and these kingdoms were largely commercial empires organized mainly for administering the gold-rich trans-Saharan trade. The first of these West African kingdoms was Ghana. Traditions date the founding of this state somewhere around the 3rd century AD. From the 8th century until the eventual demise of Ghana, information concerning the kingdom is supported by written records. These records reveal that Ghana was a large and highly organized state with powerful kings. Gold appeared to have been the chief article of commerce as well as the chief symbol of affluence. An indication of the magnitude of commercial transaction carried on by Ghana is a promissory note equal to approximately $300,000 drawn by a Ghanaian merchant, which an Arab traveler saw in 951 AD. Descriptions of Ghana show that a Muslim elite played an important but not a dominant role in her affairs. Although the king followed his ancestral religion, The literate Muslims who lived in a town next to his capital served as his ministers and interpreters. Ghana reached its peak in the 10th and 11th century. And then in 1062, an Almoravid army from the southwestern Sahara laid siege to Ghana and in 1076 captured and sacked the capital city. Ghana was replaced in the Western Sudan by the Kingdom of Mali, which owes its significance to the work of two unique rulers, Sundiata and Mansa Musa. Sundiata, who ruled from 1230 to 1255 through conquest by a powerful army and energetic generals, extended Mali's hegemony over virtually all of the Western Sudan. Yet it was the Mansa Musa who brought Mali into international limelight. Mansa Musa, a devout Muslim, was most noted for his lavish journey or pilgrimage to Mecca, which started in 1324. Reports of this journey show that Mansa Musa started for Cairo, preceded by 500 slaves, each carrying a 6-pound staff of gold. A caravan followed consisting of 100 camels, individually laden with 300 pounds of gold. Further noted that while in Cairo, his piety, fine clothes, and generosity made a favorable impression. European cartographers paid tribute to his fame from 1339 to 1750 by replacing terra incognita, usually found on the maps of Africa, with Rex Mali or Mansa Musa Mali. In the place of elephant formerly used for the lack of towns, they substituted a picture of Musa sitting on a throne with a scepter in his hand. The third major kingdom in the Western Sudan was Songhai, a former dependency of Mali. And by the opening of the 15th century, the central power of Mali began to decline, and the rulers of Songhai were prepared to take advantage of this weakness. And under the leadership of Sani Ali, 1464 to 1492, Songhai brought one after the other of Mali's dependents under her control. When Sani Ali's expansionist program had run its course, Songhai was an even greater kingdom than Mali had been. Yet it was Askariya Muhammad, Sani Ali's successor, a ruler from 1493 to 1528, who consolidated Songhai's power and restored the Muslim influence disrupted by his predecessor's imperialistic thrust. Although Songhai as a political entity was destroyed by a Moroccan expeditionary force in 1591, the two centers of learning at Timbuktu and Janneh on the Niger River flourished for another century. And thus we say the history of these three kingdoms is sufficient to show that, contrary to the ignorant, savage, servile stereotype, the black people of West Africa had organized and ruled large and complex political organization before the opening of the modern period. You see, and so this, as we know, this information seemed to have been lost to the scholars of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. Further, their relentless efforts to control the gold trade and the ruthlessness with which they struck down their enemies probably indicates that, savage or not, they were probably no more noble than any other people facing similar circumstances. Philip Curtin notes that Africa's cultural lag vis-à-vis Europe in 1750 was mainly technological, and that if the comparison is pushed back to 750 BC, the societies of Britain and the Western Sudan were probably on par. This comment, while incisive, does not fully make the point, since the validity of African culture does not rest on its parity or lack of parity with the culture of Europe, but on its own internal integrity. The reconstruction of the African past along lines more consistent with the reality, coupled with the rise of independent status of numerous African states, have gone far toward modifying the negative image which even some Afro-Americans held of Africa. To some extent, the Afro-Americans' attitude toward Africa has gone full circle. In an article in the Negro Reference Book, Sinclair Drake notes that during the first 200 years of existence in America, blacks had a general tendency to refer to themselves as Africans and use the term African in the names of their organizations. So that's not a new process. For example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, you see, most of their organizations, whether they were religious or social organizations, had the term African in the title. Professor Drake believes that this practice was discontinued because free blacks felt that they might be told to go back to Africa. This apprehension appeared as a real threat because of the activities of the American Colonization Society in connection with the settlement of Liberia. It is possible also that the derogatory image of Africa, which reached its peak in the 19th century, was also taking its toll. Yet, as Drake notes again, all Afro-Americans were forced to react to the derogatory image because of their partial African descent and because the society in which they live would not allow them to forget that they were black. Other than the efforts of the Colonization Society just mentioned, only the abortive Delaney-Garnett project during the Civil War received much attention from blacks. The Africa interest of American blacks during the first half of the 20th century centered around, 1, the missionary tradition, and 2, Pan-Africanism. Between the end of the Civil War and the close of the 19th century, a number of black missionaries saw service in Africa, some of whom were sent by white mission boards. There was a widespread belief that black missionaries could better withstand the African climate and diseases, and that they would be more effective in winning converts. By 1900, this stream of black missionaries to Africa had considerably lessened because of their being branded as subversives by white settlers and some colonial officials. Although it was the black denomination like the autonomies that were most suspect, a shadow was cast over all black missionaries. The chief result of black missionary work in Africa was the establishment of schools and churches and providing for African students to come to America for study. Despite charges of subversion, the response of black missionaries to Africa was at times ambivalent. While on a mission to, quote, redeem, unquote, Africa, some of them at the same time reflected attitudes toward Africans and their culture similar to those of their white colleagues. The most important Afro-American involved in the Pan-African movement was W.E.B. Dubois. Beginning in 1900, Dubois attended several Pan-African congresses, and from the founding of the official voice of the NAACP, the crisis in 1910, to the mid-1930s, Dubois articulated his views on the African problem. The short-lived Garvey movement of the teens and 1920s and the World War II organization, the Council on African Affairs, which was led by Paul Robeson, served to keep alive African-American interests in Africa until the independence movement came into fruition. It might be pertinent to ask at this point, what discernible effect has Africa had on the American black man? James Baldwin, in Nobody Knows My Name, spoke of the impact of African independence in 1961 in this way, and I quote, "The American Negro can no longer be controlled by the white America's image of him. This fact has everything to do with the rise of Africa in world affairs. At the time that I was growing up, Negroes in this country were taught to be ashamed of Africa. One was always being mercilessly scrubbed and polished as though the stain could be washed away. The women were forever straightening and curling their hair and using bleaching creams. But none of this is so for those who are young. By the time they were able to react to the world, Africa was on the stage of history. This could not have extraordinary effect on their morale, for it meant that they were not merely the descendants of slaves in a white Protestant Puritan country. they were also related to kings and princes in ancestral homes far, far away. And this has proved to be a great antidote to the poison of self-hatred, unquote. One final point. Professor Thomas Pettigrew of Harvard University found in a recent study on skin color and orientation toward Africa that the recent rise of Africa is especially important in the changing self-images of very dark Negro Americans, unquote. The study revealed that dark-skinned blacks are acutely aware of Africa. They, that is the study group, felt that African independence had both enhanced the self-concept of black Americans and aided in the civil rights struggle. When educated, they were also better informed about African affairs. Thus, we conclude that the black man's image of his African background at any relevant point in time has had a persistent shaping effect upon his self-concept and upon his worldview.
Thank you, Dr. King. And if there's any questions you'd like to ask him, feel free. He'll be here for a few more minutes.
Just could you sort of give some remarks on the need of a Black Studies department in schools, especially like the nature of Augsburg College? A lot of people feel as though that is important. If you expound on that a little bit.
I don't think that we really need to comment on the question of the need. I think that I think that's a given. I think what we're going to talk about, what shape should it take, and what should be its philosophical basis, and where we should expand from that point. See, the other way around seems to me to be providing a justification, which I simply don't do. I take it's a given that it ought to be here. If it isn't, that's just a shortcoming on the part of the insight of people in power. And so I don't comment on that part. But I think that just to, let me take that question and move into something else. I think that, for example, that Western civilization has come upon hard times. I think the whole Western intellectual tradition has come upon hard times, and I think that there is such a discrepancy, such a dichotomy between what the Western intellectual tradition says that what Western society is all about and what it is actually all about, that we cannot any longer attribute that to sin. See, we used to could say you could write it off as sin, but I think now that the dichotomy there is so glaring that we can't even do that. As a matter of fact, that if we look at the premises on which Western civilization is built, we can't see how we can even come to any logical conclusions about the direction in which we should go, because for the most part, the premises on which the whole Western intellectual tradition is based have proved to be false. Even if you just look at Western civilization, the history and the experience of people in Western society, we have to conclude that the premises on which that intellectual tradition is based must be false. Therefore, then, if that is the case, it does not matter whether one thinks logically or illogically about Western society, you see, because the conclusions are going to be what? Inevitably false anyway. Now, so what needs to be done, not so much in terms of ought Black studies be in major Western institution. I think for their own salvation, they better be there, because you're going to have to get some new or fresh premises on which to base an intellectual tradition that's a viable intellectual tradition, and I don't see anywhere else that they can come from.
Where do you think the white schools let's say, in bringing such a head of the department over there, what part could the white students play in bringing them about to college? Strong, they have Black Studies program over here, but they don't have people that are here all the time. It's sort of a come-in type thing, shall we say, here part of the time, and other parts of the time it's not going on.
Well, I think that if you view the whole history and experience of all of the development of all of these departments, then it would become virtually clear to you that the initiative and the sustained systematic drive for this kind of thing must come from probably a core black students. Now, and because I think that what is involved here is a kind of philosophical construct that can be only grasped and felt by people who've had a certain kind of experience. And so without that kind of direction, and without that particular philosophical construct, one cannot provide the same type of sustained systematic leadership that you would need. I think that based on what my observations have been at Minnesota and some of the other institutions I've been to, that after you get the development, you see, of a kind of a philosophical basis and a philosophical construct, and then white students become involved in it, then they can become very significant in terms of the kind of support that you get. Because we hear all of the time, we like these courses, these instructors, because they seem to be the only thing that's relevant to our lives. No, I don't think that. The only way that I think that could be a prohibition is that I think that for once the whole relationship is turned around, and if white students can come to grips with that, the power relationship is shifted, and if white students can come to grips with that, then there's no question of prohibiting. Or there would be no inhibiting factors or variables in white students becoming a part. But white students have to understand that black students have to define what it is that, where it is that they're going. See, and that I don't think that that's any different from any other group. For example, one of the reasons why we have not seen what we now see for so long is that there has not been any really intensive look, a systematic intensive look at the whole black experience from within. And as a result of that, you see, what we have had all along has been a definition of the black experience by people external to the experience. Now, what I'm suggesting is that if white students can understand that now, we see the whole history of America from an entirely different perspective, and that now that this is the process by which we see history unfolding, then that the definers of that experience are going to be people who have the peculiar ability to understand that experience. They're not right. You see, I don't think that they'll have any hang-up then. But I think where you get a hang-up is the difficulty in whites who have been accustomed to being the definers all along now find themselves, listening. And that is a tremendous hang-up. That's a hang-up, for example, I just attended a conference of about 30 about 40 black colleges where teachers are beginning to have all kinds of problems in trying to teach all black students, white teachers, that is. And so what I think that what needs to be understood very clearly is that the power relationship has changed a little bit, and the willingness to accept that.
We can't hear you.
Yeah.
He couldn't hear you either.
Minnesota Black Studies. What you do about the problem inside here is blacks coming out of the earth and things they're saying here, my chance to put it together, or figure out who I am and what my identity is. At this particular time, I don't want white students in this class because it was really the first process is difficult. And you get the problem of what state black students, white students working together.
I think that Joe's comment probably would have been quite valid in 1968, 1969. I don't think it is now. I think that there's no question about the fact that in 68, 69 that there was a problem of okay, we've got an opportunity now. How are we going to put this thing together? And see, I don't think that is any different, you see, from the football coach, calling his players into a huddle where he exclude newsmen, you see, to work out his strategy. Once he gets himself together, then he can come out and deal with the other team. So when I'm saying that kind of thing did happen, I think that kind of thing did happen in 68 and 69, simply because of the fact that not having the opportunity to define anything for themselves for, in their whole life, in the history and the whole experience, blacks now had to simply get themselves together and define and set out in some kind of systematic way which direction they were going. And at that time they didn't need to be, coming to grips with a lot of other changes that of necessity would have disrupted that process. Now, I don't think that it has not been my feeling that in the past year, or for 1970 and going to certainly in 71, that kind of thing is any longer a problem, because I think blacks know where they're going. Any other questions? Comments? Thank you.